Every story has a beginning, a mystery waiting to be unraveled, a truth lurking in the shadows. Here at Charlie's Tales, I bring you the strangest, the darkest, and the most unbelievable stories from around the world. Some are terrifying, some are tragic, but all of them will leave you thinking. So sit back, listen closely, and let's dive into today's tale. On the 26th of April 2003, 27-year-old Aron Ralston embarked on what was supposed to be a routine day of canyoneering in Utah's remote Blue John Canyon. An experienced outdoorsman with a passion for solo adventures, Ralston had tackled numerous challenging terrains before, but on this particular day, he made a critical error that would lead to one of the most harrowing survival stories in modern history. Ralston hadn't told anyone where he was going. No family member, no friend, no coworker had any idea of his whereabouts. This decision, seemingly insignificant at the time, would soon prove nearly fatal. He had parked his truck at the trailhead and mounted his mountain bike for the approach to the canyon, bringing only a small backpack with basic supplies. About a liter of water, some snacks, a cheap multi-tool knife, a small first aid kit, a digital camera, and a video camera. Notably absent was a proper knife or a satellite phone, items that could have dramatically altered the outcome of his journey. About 6 hours into his excursion, Ralston was navigating through a narrow slot canyon when disaster struck. While descending, he dislodged an 800-pound boulder. In a terrifying moment that would forever change his life, the massive rock shifted, plummeted, and pinned his right hand and wrist against the canyon wall. The initial shock gave way to frantic attempts to free himself. Ralston pushed, pulled, and tried to chip away at the boulder with his cheap multi-tool knife. But the enormous rock wouldn't budge. He was completely trapped in a standing position, his arm immobilized in a crevice barely 3 feet wide. The walls around him rose hundreds of feet into the air, making it impossible for anyone to hear his cries for help. The canyon was so remote and seldom traveled that the chances of someone passing by were virtually non-existent. As the first day turned to night, the brutal reality of his situation began to sink in. The temperature in the desert dropped dramatically, and Ralston was wearing only a t-shirt and shorts. To combat the cold, he had to perform whatever limited movements he could while standing in his fixed position. He would alternate between shivering uncontrollably and forcing himself to do standing crunches and one-arm pushes against the canyon wall to generate body heat. By morning, Ralston had formulated a plan to try to create a pulley system using his climbing gear to move the boulder. He spent hours rigging ropes and carabiners, only to have each attempt fail. The boulder was simply too heavy, wedged too tightly into the narrow space. His right hand had lost all feeling, turning a ghostly white from lack of circulation, while the pain in his trapped arm had become excruciating. On the second day, Ralston began carefully rationing his water, taking only small sips to combat the desert heat that poured into the canyon during daylight hours. He tried to conserve energy, knowing that each calorie burned brought him closer to complete exhaustion. He used his video camera to record messages to his family, cataloging his predicament and expressing his love and regrets. These recordings served as both a final testament and a way to maintain his sanity in the face of crushing isolation. By the third day, dehydration began to take a serious toll. His urine had turned a dark amber color, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. Desperate for moisture, he began drinking his own urine, collecting it in his water bottle and forcing himself to consume it, despite the revolting taste. Nights were an endless battle against the cold. Sleep came in brief, delirious snatches, only to be interrupted by the painful jolts of his body trying to maintain its core temperature. During these dark hours, Ralston began to hallucinate, seeing visions of rescue teams arriving, only to have them dissolve into the shadows of the canyon walls. He would talk to himself constantly, sometimes arguing, sometimes pleading, using his voice to fill the deafening silence of his stone prison. On the fourth day, Ralston began to carve his name, date of birth, and presumed date of death into the canyon wall. He had accepted that rescue was unlikely, and that his body might not be found for months or even years. This act of recording his existence, of leaving some tangible evidence of his final moments, provided a small measure of peace amid the horror of his situation. It was also during this time that Ralston began to contemplate amputation. He had already tried using his multi-tool to cut into his arm, but quickly realized the blade was far too dull to sever bone. Nevertheless, he began to mentally prepare himself for the possibility, understanding with increasing clarity that losing his arm was the only way he might survive. The fifth day brought a profound shift in Ralston's mindset. Severely dehydrated, starving, and physically exhausted, he experienced a vivid vision that would ultimately save his life. In this vision, he saw himself playing with a small boy, a child he somehow knew was his future son. The boy had blonde hair and was running toward him, arms outstretched. In that moment, Ralston felt a surge of determination unlike anything he had experienced during his ordeal. This vision, combined with the realization that he would die within hours without taking drastic action, led Ralston to make the most difficult decision imaginable: to amputate his own arm. First, he applied a tourniquet to his upper arm, using the climbing equipment he had. Then, using the dull blade on his multi-tool, Ralston began the gruesome process of cutting through his own flesh. The pain was beyond description, but he forced himself to continue, knowing each cut brought him closer to freedom. When he reached bone, however, he discovered that the knife couldn't cut through. In a moment of desperate inspiration, he realized he could break his radius and ulna bones by leveraging them against the boulder. After positioning his arm at just the right angle, Ralston threw his body weight against it. After several agonizing attempts, he heard a sickening snap. He had broken his own bones. The sound echoed through the canyon, a ghastly testament to his will to survive. With the bones broken, Ralston proceeded with the amputation, methodically cutting through muscle, tendons, and nerves. Each slice sent waves of blinding pain through his body, and he had to pause frequently to avoid passing out. The entire process took over an hour of unimaginable pain and determination. Finally, with one last cut through the remaining tissue, Ralston was free. Blood poured from his severed limb as he quickly tightened the tourniquet. Using gauze from his small first aid kit, he wrapped the stump as best he could. Then, in a demonstration of almost superhuman fortitude, he gathered his gear and began his journey out of the canyon. The first obstacle was a 65-foot rappel down a sheer wall, a challenging maneuver even with two hands. Somehow, Ralston managed to rig his ropes one-handed and descend safely. But his trial was far from over. He still had to hike 7 miles through rugged terrain to reach his vehicle, all while severely dehydrated, in shock, and losing blood. Staggering through the desert landscape, Ralston was driven by the vision of his future son and the desperate desire to live. After hiking for about 3 hours, he miraculously encountered a Dutch family on vacation who immediately recognized his dire condition. They gave him water and food, while another hiker ran ahead to call for help. A rescue helicopter arrived within hours and transported Ralston to a hospital in Moab, Utah. Doctors were astonished by his condition. He had lost 40 pounds in just 6 days and was mere hours away from death by dehydration. His self-performed amputation, while crude, had been effective enough to keep him alive. The medical team cleaned and properly closed his wound, but the physical recovery was just the beginning of Ralston's journey. The psychological impact of his ordeal would take years to process. He would experience flashbacks, nightmares, and periods of depression. Yet, he would also develop a profound appreciation for life and human connection that few ever achieve. In the months following his rescue, Ralston's story captured international attention. He appeared on television shows, gave interviews, and eventually wrote a memoir titled Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which would later inspire the Academy Award-nominated film 127 Hours, directed by Danny Boyle and starring James Franco. Perhaps most remarkably, just 7 months after his amputation, Ralston returned to outdoor adventures, climbing mountains and navigating canyons with a prosthetic arm. He became an advocate for wilderness safety, emphasizing the importance of always letting someone know your plans before venturing into remote areas. And in 2010, the vision that had given him the courage to sever his own arm came true. Ralston's son Leo was born, bearing a striking resemblance to the child from his canyon vision. This uncanny fulfillment of his vision only deepened Ralston's belief that there were greater forces at work during those 6 days in Blue John Canyon. Today, Aron Ralston continues to share his story as a motivational speaker, helping others find strength in their darkest moments. His experience serves as both a cautionary tale about the unforgiving power of nature and an extraordinary example of human resilience. When asked about his decision to amputate his arm, Ralston often says it wasn't a choice between his arm and his life. It was a choice to embrace whatever future might await him, to believe that something better existed beyond his current suffering. In the end, Ralston's story transcends simple survival. It speaks to the profound reserves of courage that can be found in moments of extreme adversity and the powerful human drive to live, to connect, and to continue forward, even when the path requires unimaginable sacrifice. If you enjoyed today's story, please make sure you like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.